Welcome back to Social Psychology. I'm your professor, Ryan Keith. This week we're talking about group functioning, which I remember all the way back when I was in my first social psychology class, I thought was kind of a confusing title. I mean, after all, isn't group functioning what we've been talking about all along here? How people function in groups and interact with each other? Well, that's kind of true. Really, what we've been focusing on is how other people affect the way we think and act, and how we in turn affect the way that they think and act. This week is all about how we interact together to form a group, and kind of like how all the cells in your body work together to make you an organism do stuff. It's about how groups function, kind of like organisms, and what we can expect them to do well and what we can expect them to do poorly. Today, in particular, that's really what we're going to be focusing on. How it is we know how a group is going to affect you doing something effectively versus you doing something poorly. In this way, there's going to be a number of specific terms we're going to be using today to talk about this stuff. But two of the particular terms that I really like that come into play here are social facilitation and social inhibition. Even psychologists who don't study social psychology know the idea of social facilitation pretty well. It's this really well known concept that whether we're talking about working at a job like at Publix or running a race, just being in the presence of other people seems to facilitate us, make us do better. Right. In this way, like you've been in a situation where you do better at practice or even better at a game than you do practicing on your own. You do better at video games when you're playing with your friends. It doesn't matter how many times you've practiced shooting free throws on your own. When you're playing horse against somebody, it's like there's this extra level of motivation that pushes you to go, well, maybe literally the extra mile. So a lot of instructors take this information and then apply it in their classrooms. Doing presentations in front of a class should motivate you to do better than practicing on your own. Taking a test in person in a room full of people should motivate you to do better too. But is this always the case? In fact, what we tend to see is that while the mere presence of others, and this is another term, mere presence, the mere presence effect, where merely having the presence of other people, that can motivate you to do better in certain contexts, we tend to see that social inhibition also comes into play. And that social inhibition means that sometimes being around other people causes us to do more poorly. So, how can we reconcile this idea that sometimes being around other people makes us do better and sometimes it makes us do worse? Why is it that we sometimes do better in certain contexts than we do in others? Here, I'm going to go ahead and transition us so that you can see a super cool slide now, right? And we can talk a little bit about what it is that makes us do well and poorly in this psychology update. To do this, I want to introduce you guys to a motivational concept called the Yerkes-Dodson Law. The Yerkes-Dodson Law relates together two concepts that I think you guys probably understand well: performance and stress, arousal, or anxiety. And in this way, it helps us understand, like, when is it that we're going to do relatively well versus relatively poorly? And when we look at that relationship between performance and stress, arousal, and anxiety, the relationship is probably one that you would guess it to be. You need a certain amount of stress, arousal, or anxiety. We want to think about this like feeling kind of hyphy, right? Charged up, that you have to have a certain amount of that in order to get started on stuff. This is why, like, we never get started on a project until you really need to. Even if you knew about a paper at the very beginning of the semester, you're not going to get started on it right away because there's not a whole lot of stress over here. But a certain amount of stress helps us perform pretty well and get things done better. And then there's this like peak amount of stress where you've got some but not too much stress, and that stress improves your performance. Of course, on the other hand, you can end up having way too much stress that gets in the way. Now, this isn't all there is. Like, again, this might be a relationship that you could have predicted on your own, but this isn't all there is to the Yerkes-Dodson law. Because what the Yerkes-Dodson law predicts is that this relationship is similar, but still different, depending on whether the task is easy or difficult. What you'll notice with an easy task over here, easy task over here, is that it takes a little bit more to get you moving on an easy task. The fact that it's not cognitively stimulating, when I say easy or difficult, I mean like mentally difficult. A mentally difficult task doesn't take a whole lot to get you going. It's easy to worry about it and get rolling on it. But a mentally easy task, think about the sort of stuff that you've had to do for like hourly labor. Maybe it's unloading boxes from a truck, or fronting and facing something at a grocery store, or like literally carrying stuff from one place to another. Certain sports like track and field events can be included in this, right? Especially ones that are like run or run fast. Any task that doesn't require much mental effort, like it takes more to get you going, but you can also operate under a greater amount of stress. If, for example, you were to take a look up here at the peak amount of stress to keep you performing well in a difficult task, you'll notice you're not at peak performance in an easy task. If you move over to where your peak performance is on the easy task, you'll notice you're already under too much stress. And what does that too much stress look like when we talk about too much stress for a difficult task? That too much stress for a difficult task means like you're so stressed out, you're procrastinating. You're so anxious, you can't focus. You're distracted by your stressful thoughts and you can't keep working on what it is you need to be working on, right? This is where you have a hard time focusing in a math test, or maybe you blank out in the middle of a presentation. Now, what I love about the Yerkes-Dodson law is that it really elegantly ties together, using only a couple of factors, what we would call emotional arousal and performance. And that helps explain like a number of other factors that, social psychologists have worked hard to explain our social facilitation and inhibition using models like the dominant response model or the distraction conflict model to help us understand why it is we do poorly. But in the end, I love how the Yerkes-Dodson law just distills it down to these two main factors. One way to think about it is that when we talk about the distraction conflict or the dominant response theory that are described in your textbook, they're more explanations of why the Yerkes-Dodson law shows us what we do. Both of them aim to say that we get social facilitation or social inhibition in the presence of others based on the kind of tasks that we're engaged in. But they all boil down to this idea that it's a really good idea, for example, to practice your presentation in a mirror by yourself before you get in front of others, because being in front of other people is stressful. Being in front of other people is stressful because of, and again, being psychologists, we give this an overly complex name because of something called evaluation apprehension. Evaluation apprehension means that we're afraid of being judged, but also that people don't even have to be doing anything for you to feel like you might be getting judged. Even though you know for a fact that if you're in the audience, you're not paying any attention to the presentation, the mere presence of other people tends to elevate your anxiety level, that emotional arousal. That elevation of emotional arousal, if we look at the Yerkes-Dodson law, can give us a little bit of a prediction for how you're likely to perform. If you're already stressed out on this difficult task like a presentation or a math test because you're worried about doing poorly, and then something else elevates that stress further, like you being in the presence of other people, that's going to have an inhibiting rather than facilitating effect on your performance. Why we get this effect can also be explained by the dominant response model. The dominant response model says that for every task, you have kind of a dominant response that you fall back on when you're in that situation. If it's a task that you've performed a lot, if you're really well practiced at it, or it's relatively easy, like putting one foot in front of the other, when you get stressed out, you fall back on that dominant response. The reason you fall back on that dominant response is explained by the distraction conflict model, that when you are stressed, you have a hard time focusing and thinking critically. And as a result, you have this conflict between what it is you want to be focusing on and what it is you're actually focusing on, your anxiety, which is distracting. So to boil all of this down, what this means is, if you have something you need to do, simply being around other people can raise your anxiety level. The same way that a threat of being fired or a promise of a bonus can also raise your anxiety level. If this task is relatively easy, that's not going to be a problem, and it might even result in social facilitation. The mere presence of others is enough to cause this to happen, and that evaluation apprehension is what raises your anxiety level. Again, if this is something you know well, it's in your bones, it's well practiced, or it's really easy, that extra anxiety is just going to make you go harder and faster and do better. If this is something that's difficult, in contrast, you're going to experience that conflict, this distraction conflict model. You're going to experience a conflict that's going to cause you to be distracted, and you're going to fall back on your dominant response, which is not going to be particularly well practiced, and you're going to end up doing poorly. In either case, the dominant response and distraction conflict models, the mere presence effect, and evaluation apprehension explain what we see here in the Yerkes-Dodson law, which is that if a task is easy, making people more stressed a lot of times is going to make them do better, pushing them to be better. But if it's a relatively difficult task, if it includes any level of cognitive involvement, math work, giving presentations, trying to figure out how to effectively parent your kids, your children, any level of stress is probably going to make your performance go down. So I really like this because it helps elegantly explain why we see the way that groups affect us the way we do in a lot of different contexts. If you have questions about any of these models, any of these terms, or how to remember them effectively, just reach out to me. I'm available on Google Hangouts during my office hours, but because of all this crazy coronavirus stuff, you can also call or text me at my posted number pretty much anytime. I can't guarantee I'll answer right away, but I'll get back to you as soon as I possibly can. Of course, reaching out to me via email is also an easy way to go. Remember our number one rule in the class: don't panic, and we'll all be successful this semester together. I'm your professor, Ryan Keith, and I cannot wait to keep talking to you about social psychology, especially the social psychology of pandemics like this.